Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of Fuel the Pedal podcast. I am your host Gabriel Martins. Thank you for taking the time for tuning in again. We are at episode number 2. And before we start this episode, I'd like to start thanking you all for the positive comments that some of you have been doing this past weeks through email and other communication channels, and also to everyone sharing episode number 1 on social media, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. It really means a lot now that this project is starting, and it surely motivates me to continue this show. We are at episode number 2 with a very special guest. This episode is entitled Fuel for the Work Required, Amplifying Training Adaptations by Manipulating Carbohydrate Ingestion. Today we'll get a little bit deeper into training low models, such as training twice a day, sleep low, train low, in a model referred as Fuel for the Work Required by Dr. Sam Impey, along with other researchers such as Graham Close and James Morton. Dr. Sam Impey is our guest today. He has a PhD in nutritional manipulation of exercise-induced skeletal muscle cell signaling while studying in Liverpool John Moores University. Currently, Sam is an adjunct lecturer at Edith Cowan University in Perth, Australia, in a joint role also working as a sports scientist with the UC Pro Tour team Michelton Scott. Sam is the right person to cover this topic, and I'm really looking forward to this interview. Let's not waste any more time and have Sam do all the talking. Hi Sam, thank you for accepting my invitation. How's it going?
Hey, yeah, good, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me on episode 2.
Yeah, it's an absolute honor to have you here on board, and I can't wait to start this interview. So Sam, I've already introduced you a little bit, but before we start, could you please introduce yourself and talk a bit about your background and how did you come to study the topics that we are covering on the show today, and eventually some research that you might be doing at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Dr. Sam Impey. I'm actually currently a adjunct lecturer at Edith Cowan University in Perth. Just started there at the beginning of the year, and I'm also working then as a joint position as a sports scientist with Michelton Scott, who are a World Tour cycling team. I did my PhD at Liverpool John Moores under the directorship of James Morton and Graham Close, and that was looking at how you can manipulate carbohydrate availability in and around exercise and the adaptations that kind of potentially brings about at a muscular level. After my PhD, I did 2 postdocs, one at John Moores and one at the University of Birmingham, and that was again kind of following a theme looking at how the body utilizes muscle glycogen during exercise training in the first one, and then looking at how exogenous carbohydrates are burnt during exercise at Birmingham as well.
Okay, awesome, Sam. Really, really interesting. No one else better to talk about this topic than yourself. So in the end of this interview, let's hope that our listeners can understand what is all the rationale behind the fuel for the work required. And the Glycogen Threshold Hypothesis, what types of approaches are there and the differences between them, and of course how to eventually implement them. So on episode 1 we had a great talk with Dr. Javier Gonzalez on the importance of breakfast in cycling and what benefits may come from strategically skipping this particular meal on training adaptations. And today we will broaden the spectrum not only for breakfast but for this meal by meal approach in the fuel for the work required hypothesis with one of the main researchers responsible for this brilliant research. So the introduction of this, Sam, would be that, if you agree with me, of course, chronic carbohydrate has had its moment on the weight loss and sports performance realm. Endurance athletes still engage in restricting carbohydrate ingestion for weight loss purposes. Although they recognize the importance of carbohydrate for performance, I believe, they still engage in such practices. Still, and thanks to your research and some previous research before it, some new data on the effects of deliberately training with low muscle glycogen reserves have emerged, pointing out that there might be some amplifications of the training adaptations induced by training. So, Sam, how did you come to investigate this subject, and what seminal research has started pointing out on this direction?
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary of quite a complex topic. So I'll congratulate you on that one. I guess I kind of came to looking at the topic of carbohydrate manipulation, or carbohydrate periodization, or training with low carbohydrate availability, depending on, I guess, the context of how you'd call it. Just because I did my undergraduate and my master's at John Moores, where obviously James Morton had been working, and had started to look at some of the low carbohydrate training literature and conduct some of the research himself, and so because there was that interest in the field, it's obviously something that I became incredibly interested in, initially actually from a kind of molecular perspective, and certainly following on from some of the great work that Dr. John Bartlett did, looking at the phosphorylation of P53 in response to training with low carbohydrate availability. And it's kind of those sort of steps that were made at John Moores, I guess, that kind of naturally sort of led me down that path, as well as a real interest in the molecular training adaptations that can be brought about by manipulating the fuel availability. I guess some of the seminal papers, you probably go back to the Hansen paper, which was done in Bengt Saltin's group, which was kind of one of the first real papers to sort of categorically set out to look at the change in the biochemistry inside muscle following training with low carbohydrate availability, or manipulating glycogen availability inside the muscle prior to training. Some work had been done much earlier than this, actually back in the late 70s and early 80s, where they manipulated glycogen availability, but this was more from the perspective of they noticed that it caused a really big shift in the substrate metabolism. So a lot of the early work was actually looking at amino acid metabolism, which they noticed kind of increases quite a lot when you're in a very low glycogen state. So there's kind of a few indirect papers that started to look at training with or exercising with low muscle glycogen, but it was really the first paper was by the author Hansen, which was back in 2005. So it was a real seminal paper, kind of looking at once versus twice every other day training. So they'd have use a leg kicking model, so it's a leg extension model, where they had people train with their left leg, for example, and that trained once a day, so that every session was undertaken with high muscle glycogen availability. And then they had the same people train the opposite leg, so say the right leg, for example, twice every other day, so that it would do the second session. So 50% of all the sessions that were done under a state of low muscle glycogen. And obviously, kind of being within the same person, you minimize any of the kind of each leg acts as its own control. And actually, what they found was that they got a really big increase in exercise capacity, as well as the enzyme activity of some of the kind of enzymes involved in beta oxidation within the leg that trained twice every other day. And so that was kind of the real first indicator that actually maybe there's some real potential in training with low carbohydrate availability to bring about an improvement in performance, or certainly a change at the metabolic level.
Yeah, that's great, and that's really, really interesting. It's good to know how everything started for this research and what inspired further investigations on the topic, and what sort of transitioned into the models that we are studying nowadays, and some of them, with some of them you have participated and contributed as well. So Sam, just to give our guests some context on the importance of glycogen, and of course to make this transition to training with low muscle glycogen, could you explain a bit on how essential both muscle and liver glycogen are for cycling performance, and on which occasions might or might not be advisable to do a glycogen loading protocol?
Yeah, sure. I think there's I hope now that there's a lot of, certainly been a huge amount of research evidence that's demonstrated the importance of certainly muscle glycogen as being very tightly correlated with exercise performance, and certainly the point at which you reach fatigue seems to correlate kind of very, very tightly with reaching a very low muscle glycogen content. Liver glycogen as well, obviously to supply blood glucose, which obviously can then contribute to energy production during exercise as well. Also, kind of critically important. And I believe Javier kind of touched a little bit more in detail on that in episode 1, I think. So in terms of kind of muscle glycogen and how essential they are in terms of a performance, and certainly at anything close to race intensity, then you're looking at the bulk of energy during that type of work to be derived from carbohydrate sources, and the bulk of that coming from muscle glycogen. So in terms of how important it is, it's critically important, and more often than not, it's how can we sort of spare as much muscle glycogen during a race, for example, so that there's some left where you need it for either a sprint finish, or maybe if there's a summit finish, or if you're going to be working towards the higher end of exercise intensity, and certainly above the lactate threshold, however you can define that, but certainly at the higher ends of VO2 max, you get into an area where it's almost entirely glycogen dependent in terms of being able to sustain that type of power output. So it's very, very important for that. And in terms of kind of how you translate that out in terms of doing a glycogen loading protocol, for example, I think if you're going to be racing, then certainly for the 24 hours before, and that can be done with using a high amount of carbohydrate, split kind of fairly evenly across the 24 hours prior to your event. If you're just doing a training rides, or if you have kind of much shorter duration training, then you probably don't need a glycogen loading protocol at all. In terms of the kind of habitual diet is quite often provides enough carbohydrate to fuel the types of training that most people do. I think if you're kind of getting out towards really increasing the volume, so if you're trying to push to 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6 hour training rides, then it's probably advisable to try and load some of that glycogen just to maintain the quality of training that you're doing. But again, it's very dependent on the intensity as well. So there are kind of a couple really important factors to consider, I guess, which would be the intensity and the duration of training. And with those, you can kind of gauge as to whether you need to load glycogen before, or whether you need to fuel with carbohydrates during, to sustain the quality of work that you're trying to do.
Okay, great. You've mentioned some things that I consider really important for our listeners to understand what we're going to talk about next, which is that muscle glycogen is of critical importance in the key moments of each stage, because of course we are always trying to apply this to the cycling context. And glycogen sparing is one of the main priorities and ultimately maybe one of the main objectives with such approaches and with the training itself. Let's say for what you have mentioned, like a summit finish and higher ends of VO2 max. So I think we now understand more or less what's the importance of muscle glycogen and spare it as much as possible for cycling performance. So, Sam, could you get into more detail on what are the main differences in the molecular signaling and performance outcomes of the different training low strategies? Does any of the different proposed models appear to promote greater adaptations?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a really good question, and the answer is probably pretty complex depending on the model you look at. I think the probably something to say from the outset is that designing these studies is very, very difficult when you think about the kind of the types of things that you're trying to manipulate in terms of it's carbohydrate manipulation, but it's also energy manipulation. You're also then kind of manipulating the time in which you kind of measure the exercise responses. So it's very, very difficult to design these studies in the first place. So I'll give a little caveat to that. So not just defending my own research here, I'm just saying in general. So in terms of kind of the molecular signaling and performance outcomes, I think there's a whole kind of raft of data going through from kind of high end or higher sort of fit like whole body responses in terms of, as I mentioned, the shift in substrate metabolism that you see. That shift in substrate metabolism acts as a signal in itself to activate different signaling cascades within muscle cells, which then translate through into gene responses at the nucleus, which then kind of induce changes at the protein level. Hopefully, that's in theory one of the ways that it happens. By reducing the glycogen content inside the muscle as well, that appears to have a beneficial effect in terms of a lot of the studies that have exercised people where they've had them exercise with either high muscle glycogen availability or low muscle glycogen availability. And fairly consistently what you see is that you get a big increase in the activation of things like AMPK, P38, and also P53, as I mentioned, some of John's work. Kind of a whole series of different gene responses that are significantly upregulated when you train with low muscle glycogen. So in terms of the molecular effects, I think it's quite often there are such a broad spectrum of responses that we do see consistently. But again, what's important to consider is how the sort of temporal response is incorporated and how you understand that. So, for example, if we look at like the strategies of how to actually go about doing it, so whether it's training twice a day, for example, or whether it's doing a sleep low, train low. Previously people have mentioned recover low as well. And so is there one that's better than the other? I don't necessarily think that we can say that for definite at this point. Because of the variability in responses we see, certainly from a molecular perspective, it's difficult to kind of categorically pinpoint that one methodology is better than the other at this point. It certainly seems that, or we certainly know that when you do twice per day training, you absolutely compromise the capacity to perform kind of higher intensity work in that second session. So in that context, maybe using a sleep low, train low may be more beneficial. But equally, I think it kind of comes back to what we try to outline in some of the Fuel for the Work Required papers, is that you need to be strategic about the way that you apply this, and so the methodology that you use to elicit your glycogen manipulation, whether that's twice a day, whether it's sleep low, whether it's fasted training, needs to be appropriate to the type of training that you're going to be doing. So, and when you think about it in that context, then you sort of cherry pick the methodology that you're going to use and fit that to the training program that you have, as opposed to fitting the training to the type of glycogen manipulation that you want to elicit, if that makes sense. So it's always what's the training outcome first, and then you manipulate the way that you're going to alter the carbohydrate and glycogen availability to fit that training model, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, Sam, and you've touched a point that I normally like to get into as well. That is the beauty of science. That nothing is black and white, or black or white in this case, and there is a lot of variability. And people, of course, they will ask the question, just as I did, what of these strategies works best, and there isn't always a best answer or an unanimous scientific answer, and that's important that people get this idea really clear, because this happens with many things in sports sciences and in general science as well. So it's important to take into account this variability of responses that you've just mentioned. I believe that is really important. And I also really like some of the considerations and questions that your article highlights, especially the allusion to the fact that such molecular signaling and training adaptations could eventually come from energy restriction as opposed to carbohydrate restriction. And if that's the case, correct me if I'm wrong here, Sam, such approaches may have been there long before this research came to be, because cyclists are known to, and many other endurance athletes are known to intentionally restrict not only carbohydrate intake but energy intake as well. Could you please provide us some comments on this?
Yeah, I think you raise a fantastic point there, in that it's as I mentioned with when we design these studies, it's actually sometimes very, very difficult to rule out whether it's an artifact of carbohydrate restriction or glycogen manipulation versus actually just an artifact of energy deficit as well, and maybe it's a component of that, as you put such an energetic stress on the musculoskeletal system, maybe that per se, as well as the the exercise that you're doing, is causing these enhanced responses. So my personal thought is that it probably is energy, I guess my personal thought is that it probably is energy restriction, but I actually think that that energy restriction probably needs to come from carbohydrate, whether that's purely from a muscle glycogen perspective, or also kind of reducing exogenous glycogen carbohydrate availability as well. I don't think we entirely know yet. But then it's also related to things like the fat availability, and there's some excellent work from Kelly Hammond, another PhD student at John Moores, who's kind of showed that you get some differential effects when there's high fat availability as well. So it kind of ties into that whole sort of energy availability versus carbohydrate availability question, as you mentioned. So I think when you look at it like that, as well as you mentioned, it becomes kind of quite a complex scenario to try and understand, and so I think that's why we're only really starting to see now, quite early on, people begin to sort of try and apply this more strategically in their training. So as you said as well, it's been around for years as well, and it's actually now science just catching up to what people are actually already doing in performance, which quite often happens. So I think there's some there are some really interesting things that have come from that. As you mentioned, there are a lot of sports, particularly endurance sports, that strategically and intentionally kind of reduce energy availability quite often, as you mentioned earlier on, from a weight perspective. So, but maybe that is contributing towards a beneficial adaptation at the muscular level as well. I think hopefully what we're doing, or what we want to do with the carbohydrate manipulation, is that by creating small pockets of energy deficits, so instead of being in a big energy deficit across the day as a whole, actually maybe what we might be able to do is to tweak those adaptations by creating small pockets of energy or carbohydrate deficit within the day, but not necessarily causing a huge energy deficit across the day in itself, or across longer periods of time, weeks, or maybe even months in extreme cases, because you obviously have to take into consideration things like REDS, the relative energy deficiency in sport, and how we're developing a much greater knowledge base on this area, and how that can potentially be problematic from a health perspective as well as a performance perspective. So maybe by being strategic with our manipulation of carbohydrate and energy availability, we can elicit these beneficial adaptations by just manipulating the energy availability around specific exercise sessions, so that we get those beneficial adaptations, but also minimize the kind of any potential additional risks of being in an energy deficit for an extended period of time.
Sam, let's schedule this interview for 10 years from now, so we can see what happens.
Yeah.
Let's hope that the next decade, I believe, can bring us some answers that are still needed on this topic. So, in an applied context of cycling, since cyclists often have a mixed training routine days with low intensity rides, strength training sessions in the gym, cycling training sets, and long endurance rides. Normally, what we see in the literature is that normally a specific training load protocol is replicated throughout the week, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong here. Maybe it's not an alternate protocol in which cycling training is more into that context, alternating all types of training throughout the days. Taking into consideration the science that we have available, how could we as sports nutritionists fit this day-by-day, meal-by-meal plan into a cycling routine?
That's a great question, and I think this is kind of hopefully the crux of the review paper we published last year, was trying to sort of how do you fit the science into what people actually do, and so as you mentioned, we kind of came up with this the day by day and meal by meal kind of scenario as the way to try and explain it, and cycling is actually a brilliant kind of sport, or to at least to try and apply this in, because it's far easier to get an idea of the kind of energy demands of cycling. Certainly with kind of having power meters on the bike, this kind of gives you a much better readout of what the sort of energy demands of specific types of training are, and also kind of the ability to set training by wattages, or if you want to use heart rate zones, or whatever model it is, the amount of data that's available kind of on cyclists from the technology that we have is makes it far easier to do this. So I think, as you said, quite often you can have sort of a block of training where you maybe do the same kind of low carbohydrate block at the same period of time with the same training session, and then that may change for the next block. And actually, I think what we suggest is that the better way to do it is, instead of just having blocks of it, is to try and periodize it throughout your training week, depending on the focus and the goal of each training session. So how can you fuel the training session appropriately so that you're not compromising on the intensity or the duration or the training goals, but actually equally not over-fueling it, so that you're not going to kind of potentially dampen any of the adaptive responses that we see with coming towards what we term the kind of critical glycogen threshold. But then also, are there kind of sessions during the week where actually you can kind of pair your carbohydrate availability and your energy availability right back? So things like much lower intensity, almost like kind of recovery type rides, in terms of maybe they're an hour to 2 hours at very low intensity. Maybe you can pair that right back, and you could almost do that fasted or with no exogenous carbohydrate availability. And that, again, is just a way to kind of manipulate the exogenous and endogenous carbohydrate stores so that you can kind of get the most bang for your buck from the type of training that you're doing. If you're going to be doing high intensity sessions, so if you're going to be doing threshold efforts, repeated threshold efforts or VO2 efforts, then quite obviously you need to fuel that with carbohydrates, because it's a highly glycolytic type session, and you're going to need a lot of muscle glycogen and a lot of carbohydrate to sustain that type of work. So that's obviously kind of where you go to, you have your fueling plan that builds into that. But then actually after that session, you look at what the next session is, whether that's the next day, or if you've got, 2 in a day, then actually what's the kind of, how much feeding or how much carbohydrate do we need to put back in? If you have a low intensity session the next day, then actually you can just put a kind of moderate amount of carbohydrate back in, so that you can activate those recovery processes and not kind of blunt that, but equally not overfuel, so that maybe you can start the next session with slightly lower muscle glycogen, because that's a targeted sort of train low type session. But then we know that the session after that is going to be high intensity again, so we refuel, so that you're not ever compromising on the quality of the type of training that you're trying to do. So it's really taking the training plan, or taking your training plan, and the more information you have on the training that you're doing, the better that you can make your plan. So it's more strategic, your fueling plan, so it's more strategic to the type of training that you're doing, which then allows you to kind of make each of the training sessions and your fueling patterns more efficient and more bespoke to the athlete, which hopefully then can bring about greater adaptations.
Okay, those are some really important tips, Sam, to put all this into context and to be able to apply it to the different training sessions that we have. And you've mentioned something that I think it's fundamental in all this process, which is having a training plan. If you have a specific training plan for you, and normally pro cyclists do have one, but all our listeners who are not into pro cycling, of course, and may want to try and adapt all this science to their training plans. Having platforms such as Training Peaks, for example, may help them eventually organize their training plans and organizing their diet according to the sessions that they have, and always thinking ahead. I believe, Sam, thinking ahead the next workout. I believe that would be a rationale behind this. Do you agree?
Exactly. Yeah, I think if you can. If you have a platform, you mentioned Training Peaks, where you can easily visualize your next 3 days, 4 days, the next week, the next month, then that certainly gives you a much better grounding and a base from which to start planning. How you're going to fuel the sessions, and it's obviously kind of, people have to take into account things like work as well. For people who are, as you mentioned, aren't pro athletes. So, how's your training going to fit in around your work commitments, and what does your day actually look like? And with that, and with having that training plan, as you say, that gives you a much kind of better base from which to think, how am I going to appropriately fuel the types of sessions that I've got planned, so that I can get the most out of each training session, and hopefully achieve the goals and the performance targets that they want to achieve.
Sure, I think so. That it would be important to set some criteria on this while applying this, or before applying this. Is there any difference that we might have to take into account, such as the training level, the type of cyclist, his specialty, that have to be taken into consideration before applying such approach?
Yeah, I think there are some kind of a couple of basic points. Actually, one that I think Javier touched on is that obviously VO2 max, someone's VO2 max tends to correlate pretty well with their capacity to store muscle glycogen. So people with much higher VO2s tend to have much higher muscle glycogen storage capacity, and also the amount of work that someone's doing in a week. So people who are training 20 hours a week are going to need much higher carbohydrate intakes than people who are only doing 6 or 7 hours a week, or even 3 or 4 hours a week. So there's a lot to look at in terms of the volume of training and the intensity, and also it's probably worth looking at the kind of relative intensities and durations that cyclists are going to work at, and also whether they're going to be doing a lot of racing or whether they're just cycling for fitness or because they enjoy it. And so those are kind of quite important things to look at as well. So there's a brilliant review, meta-analysis done by Jose Areta actually, which was published last year, which looked at he correlated all the or most of the papers that had published glycogen usage during cycling at different exercise intensities and different durations by different fitness levels. It's an absolutely phenomenal piece of work, and that kind of quite elegantly shows how actually if you start with higher muscle glycogen, as I mentioned, the people with higher VO2s tend to do, then actually the rate of muscle glycogen usage is greater than if you start with lower muscle glycogen. So it's all about tying in, where you think your muscle glycogen start point is going to be, how long the session is, and kind of what type of athlete it is that you're working with, which is not a simple thing to do, certainly. So that's kind of why we advocated, certainly in the sports med paper, that actually it's having a really good knowledge of sports nutrition, but also just kind of the basic physiology surrounding exercise metabolism and certainly the metabolism around cycling, that will actually allow a sports nutritionist to really make a far better and a far more specific program to try and aid their athletes and support their athletes, or support their own training.
Okay, great. Since it is advisable that cyclists train their race nutrition in the weeks previous to the race events, how could we include training the gut strategies, for example, in the athlete's routine? Is there any chance that this fluctuation in carbohydrate ingestion during training, with many days ingesting low carbohydrate quantities during training, can compromise the capacity to oxidize or tolerate carbohydrate during the race?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. Again, hopefully, you mentioned it earlier. Maybe we'll reschedule this chat for 10 years time, and I'll be able to tell you absolutely for definite what the answer is. I think the way I would think about it is that a lot of the kind of train low strategies that you put into place in a training program, I think are more useful and more functional to kind of front load a program with. So when you're starting a season, or if you're coming back from off season and you're going to be trying to develop some base capacity, then I think there's more use for carbohydrate manipulation, certainly training with low carbohydrate availability in that kind of that front end of a season. And then actually as you move through to the midpoint of the season, and then in the build up to race specific, so race prep, actually the amount of low carbohydrate training sessions that you're going to do is probably going to reduce, because you're going to try and be working closer to race intensity. And as you mentioned, that's where you really need to think about how you're going to fuel the training session, because it's hopefully getting close to race intensity. But also then when you go into racing as well, that's obviously all going to be done with high carbohydrate availability. So I think that as you kind of, you can still incorporate those small periods, as we talked about, kind of periodizing little blocks of train low into a training program, but the occurrence or the frequency of them, in my head, certainly it becomes less the closer you get to racing, and as the intensity of training goes up. And so what you can do with that is then you can tie in race-specific or race-simulated fueling rides. So pick a real high, real hard intensity session, maybe 1-2 a week that you have planned in. And actually what you want to do is to do a full simulation of your race fueling strategy during that ride, so that you're kind of aware of how much food that you need to take, how many bottles you need to take, if you're going to take drink mix, if you're going to use electrolytes, if you're just going to use whole foods or gels, and that way you can you really become accustomed to the sort of GI challenge that you're going to go through, hopefully by simulating it in a high intensity workout, but also you're then making sure that you're kind of fueling those workouts to really sustain that quality of work as well.
Yeah, sure. That makes total sense to take into account the season which you're in, using the base training more like to adapt such training low strategies, because we're not still yet close to the race intensity training. Correct me if I'm wrong here.
Exactly that. Yeah.
Yeah. Mid-season would be a little bit less of training low, but still with some training low strategies that we could apply here. But with increasing carbohydrate ingestion in this mid-season, and then on the periods closer to the competition, such high intensity training sessions would be more predominant. We can take some of them to try and apply a gut training protocol, for example, and try and simulate as best as possible our race nutrition in order to be able to oxidize and tolerate carbohydrate. That was a really great point to clarify. And Sam, about this the fuel for the work required model schematics that you present on your research paper, how could we know or establish the approximate carbohydrate quantity according to the different colors of this model? Just to clarify our listeners, the training low model is organized by colors, in which the red color symbolizes a meal which is low in carbohydrate. The orange, sort of yellowish color represents medium carb content meal, and the green represents the high carb content meal. So the question here is trying to understand what factors need to be taken into consideration when establishing a specific quantity within this model to then applying the fuel for the work required approach.
Yeah, I guess I might answer the last part of your question first, in terms of is there debate amongst researchers about kind of what these numbers are? I think absolutely there are. No one's kind of put forward any definitive numbers onto what is low, what is medium, or what is a high kind of carbohydrate meal in the context of carbohydrate periodization. And I think that's because there is a really quite a wide diversity of factors that you need to take into consideration with this. Personally, the way I would look at it is try and think back to kind of what are daily carbohydrate recommendations. So, if you look at some of the ACSM guidelines in terms of if you're doing 1 to 3 hours of planned, focused, set exercise of medium to high intensity, then you need kind of upwards of 5 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body mass per day, for example, say. And when you take that into consideration, and then you kind of have a rough idea for the total daily carbohydrate intake, then actually what you can do is you can break that down across the day, and then split it up so that you can either front load and fuel your session, or if you're doing like a fasted session, then you can apply it, you can balance out the spread of carbohydrates across the rest of the day, so you can fuel the recovery but not over fuel it, and then have an even energy balance across the day, or even carbohydrate intake across the day. I think that's quite a good way to do it, if you're, because you then sort of make it a little bit more specific for each person, in terms of you have a rider who is doing, maybe only 1 hour of cycling a day, then you look at what their kind of carbohydrate requirements would be, potentially 3 to 5 grams per kilogram of body mass. You then split that up over, say, 3 meals and 2 snacks. That then gives you a much better breakdown of how to, or of how much carbohydrate to put into each meal and each snack based on the type of work that they're doing. Then, the flip side of that, you have elite athletes who are doing 5+ hours of, medium to high intensity work, who are kind of upwards of 8 to 12 grams per kilogram body mass. And then again, what you do is you break that down maybe into, maybe it's 3 meals, but you'll have a big in-ride fueling as well, because of the duration of exercise. And that then again allows you to sort of strategically plan where to put how many kind of grams of carbohydrate, or how many grams per kilogram per meal. I think if you look at the total amount kind of roughly that you'd need for the day based on some of the recommendations in the literature, and then break that down into the number of meals that you're going to have, that's a really kind of good way to start. And it's also very scalable, so you can scale it from someone who's doing 30 minutes to an hour a day up to people who are doing 5-6 hours a day. And it's just about kind of splitting up the amount of carbohydrate based on the number of meals that you're going to have, and then obviously fluctuating that based on where your exercise session is, and what type of session it is, and whether you want to try and incorporate some component of low glycogen availability or energy manipulation around that. I think if you look at, the reason I think it's difficult to put specific amounts and to say that this is what we say low carb is, this is what we say medium carb is, and this is what we say high carb is that actually if you look at it in the context of different sports, for example, then if you're working with 120 kilo rugby players, and then you say to them, all right, we actually, if you fix a medium meal at 1 gram per kilo, for example, or 1.5 grams per kilo, or a high meal at 2 grams per kilo, then, the actual amount of carbohydrate based on the glycolytic demands of the sport versus cycling, for example, where you might have a 70 kilo athlete, that then really skews the application based on what we know the sort of glycolytic demands are for those two sports. So I think that's why it's been really problematic in making definitive recommendations to say that a low carb meal is this, a high carb meal is this in terms of grams per kilo. So I think that's why I'd always start on how much would the literature say that you kind of roughly need for the day, and split it up that way.
That's important to consider. Context is definitely key in all these applications. So, Sam, is there any way in which technology can be used in applying these carbohydrate periodization models?
I think, there's. I don't think any real research has been done on it yet, but it certainly seems kind of logical to me that with the development that there has been in mobile technology, that the ability to use apps to program kind of carbohydrate periodization based on someone's training protocol is certainly something that would make sense to me. As you mentioned earlier, things like you have platforms like Training Peaks and stuff where have access to an external client's training program, and then that allows us to quite well quantify what their energy demands are going to be during training and their training durations, and then with that allows us to you could potentially program for an athlete remotely. And I think in terms of how it's going to be applied, I think that field's going to develop massively over the next, the next few years. And, hopefully, again, there'll be kind of more research done into really understanding the glycogen turnover of within different sports and different athletes within different sports. And, understanding the kind of adaptations behind what the differences are with training with low carbohydrate availability, and if there's an optimal way to apply that as well, and maybe incorporating different components of mobile technology or different platforms into those research ideas. I think will really drive this field.
Yeah, sure. Let's hope for the developments in understanding the turnover of different sports through that mobile technology. That would really come in handy into understanding how everything works and adapting perfectly to each athlete according to its specific demands and its glycogen threshold as well. That would be awesome. And of course, again, if we repeat this interview in 10 years, let's hope we can answer many of the things that remain to be answered with this podcast. So the wrap it up question, Sam, what research advances on nutrition and exercise metabolism would you like to see in the next decade?
Well, I think there's been some really interesting developments actually in the field of train low and carbohydrate periodization. I know Dave Bishop was on a paper published just a couple of weeks ago that kind of the headline was that it wasn't glycogen per se that caused a training response in the subjects that they had, and that actually it was training twice per day. I think that kind of throws up a whole load of questions around. Is it glycogen dependent? Is it energy dependent? I personally thought it was it's a phenomenal piece of research, but I don't know that I don't think we can kind of really say definitively what it is that causes these training adaptations yet. Whether it's glycogen availability or energy availability, or maybe it's just the proximity of training sessions. So there's also things around, as we touched on earlier, is it, manipulating the substrate availability during these sessions? So is high fat availability actually going to elicit a different response or higher fat, but not kind of the ketogenic levels of fat? A higher fat availability going to influence the way that skeletal muscle adapts? I think a lot more work needs to be done on translating this out as well from being just seeing molecular responses. I think we also need to do more work on trying to elicit what the optimal way to derive a performance response is. I mean, if you actually look at it kind of fairly objectively, the data that shows an improvement in performance is almost equivocal to the amount of data that shows no improvement in performance in training high versus training low, or periodizing carbohydrate availability, I should say. So, but it's, so I think there's definitely more work to be done on optimizing this as a nutrition strategy to elicit a performance response. And it's interesting when I talk to a lot of people who work in this field and who do research in this field as well. I think that's echoed quite often, is that there's most people who apply it and kind of look at the research and think, this works and this makes sense, but there's definitely a consensus that we need to make this optimal in terms of how is best to apply it, and where are the sort of key determinants that are going to allow us to understand how best to manipulate glycogen and carbohydrate to elicit performance responses. I think there's a whole load of molecular questions that still need to be answered. I think you've got excellent scientists like Dan Owens looking at that over in over in John Moore's and James as well, who are continuing to work in that field. So, I'm sure we'll see, as well, there's guys like Dave Bishop and people all over the world working on it now, which is fantastic. So hopefully, we'll have a much greater depth and a richness of data in terms of the molecular adaptations, which will hopefully allow us to influence some of the or understand maybe some of the adaptations that we see on a more whole body and peripheral level, and maybe allow us to tweak some of the performance goals as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I'm surely looking forward to see that in the next couple of years as well. So, okay, perfect, Sam. I think we've covered a lot of important info here, and let's hope our listeners have got a new perspective and a more specific view of how to apply all these approaches into their routine, whether they are sports nutritionists, sports scientists, or cyclists themselves. And so if people want to know more about the work that you've done and the work that you're involved with right now, is there any place where people can go?
I use Twitter most of the time for work contact stuff. So I'm at Sam Impey _. Really original Twitter handle, I know. So you can find me there. Also, you can see some of my publications on PubMed as well. I think that's probably the best two ways to see what I'm doing. So, and hopefully, I'll be publishing some kind of really applied work with the guys I'm working with now, the World Tour team. Hopefully, we're going to get some research projects going, looking at nutrition interventions on those levels as well. So, things to come in the pipeline from me, I hope.
Okay, looking forward to that as well. And I will leave these links that Sam just pointed out on the show notes on fuelthepedal.com. Sam, again, it has been an absolute pleasure having you here. I hope our listeners have enjoyed this as much as I did, and I hope you have too, Sam.
That's been great. Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Sam. I wish you the best of luck and hope to talk to you soon.
Champion, thanks.
So that was Sam Impey, sports scientist in Mitchelton Scott's cycling team. I hope you have taken many important notes from this episode. If you did enjoy this episode, I'd really appreciate if you could share it with your peers through Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or another platform. The show notes of this episode will be on fuelthepedal.com, and you can listen to this and other episodes directly on the player available on the website, and also subscribing the show on Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to have you listening to the next episodes.